So, Paizo uses the concept of a recipe to help game masters understand how to design adventures. That raises the important question, what is the allegorical equivalent of the potato in adventure design? And is that the romantic style subplot? Today we're going to talk about adventure design in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who comes from an Irish family, which means there's probably going to be a lot of potato jokes in this video. I'm afraid I can't help myself. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e, a series where we take a look at the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers storytellers to help us be more successful when running Pathfinder 2e at our gaming tables. Now, this is a series that is intended for storytellers of all skill levels from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not your preferred game, I still invite you to be part of the conversation. I have long observed that studying a multitude of games gives us great ideas to bring back to our favorite game. So, regardless of what you play or how long you've been playing it, I invite you to be part of the conversation. Today, we're continuing our discussion of Paizo's recommended approach for campaign design. Now, in previous videos, we've talked about how Paizo presents a very top-down view of how to go about designing a campaign. You start with the largest idea, the broadest strokes, which is your campaign structure, and then you move down to adventure design and eventually focus in on encounter design. We've talked for a couple of weeks about campaign structure itself, so today we're moving on to that second step, adventure design. Now, in the context of the scheme that Paizo gives us, adventure design can be considered story arcs inside of your campaign. If you think of your campaign as the big picture you're trying to paint, then adventure design is the smaller sections inside of that painting, the distinct windows into various parts of the painting that each contain their own unique themes and elements. Adventures, really as Paizo presents them, are story arcs, so today we're going to start talking about how to construct a story arc and the different types of story arcs that you might include in your campaigns. But before we get into all of that, don't forget to do all of the YouTube stuff. Please like and share the video, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. You can check out my free Discord or support the channel financially through my Patreon. Both of those links are in the video description. And the most important thing you can do is jump down into the comments section and be part of the conversation. I have a fantastic community. I love the insights I get from interacting with you all, so please join the conversation. But with all that in mind, let's get started. Alright, so today we get to talk about adventure design. By the way, we are revisiting some of the pages that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, but today, in specific, we're going to be looking at content that is found in the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e from pages 40 to 43, so if you're interested in reading a little more in depth, especially about the adventure design styles that I will mention later, that's where you can go to get some more information. You should have the well-established idea at this point that adventures in Paizo's scheme of campaign building are the story arcs inside your campaign. They are self-contained narratives, or mostly self-contained narratives, that exist inside the larger story of your campaign. Adventures play out typically over several sessions. Sometimes it might be as few as 3 or 4 sessions, sometimes it might last 9 or 10 sessions, but essentially it is a self-contained narrative story arc that could almost function as its own short story apart from the larger picture. But today, we get to talk about Paizo's interesting choice of allegory in discussing adventure design: recipes. Listen, no shame in my game, I'm willing to talk food. If you think of a campaign as a multi-course meal, then adventures essentially are individual dishes served inside the meal that each serve to complement the overall experience. And one of the things that a good chef knows is that every plate in a meal has its own purpose and is distinct from the other parts of the meal. The soup, the salad, the main course, they all have their place at the table, but each is its own experience in terms of the food that you get to enjoy. Man, I am going to be starving by the end of this video. But I do like Paizo's use of the recipes allegory here, because that does drive home a very important point that we've talked about in this series. Different adventures, different story arcs, different recipes are one of the great places to add variety to your campaign. It is easy to sink a campaign if the experiences get too stale or too repetitive. You want to have variety in what you do, and the adventures, the story arcs, these are the recipes where you can spice things up. Now, the way Paizo organizes this particular section of the Game Mastery Guide is not the way I plan on organizing this video. Paizo presents a number of different styles, or recipes if you will, that you can use for different adventures. And by the way, they give us 9 different styles: dungeon crawl, gritty adventures, high adventure, horror, intrigue, military, mystery, planar adventures, romantic adventures. They give us a variety of different types of stories that you can tell, or dishes that you can serve to your player, but if we were to go through each of those styles individually, 1, we would see a lot of repetition in the points being discussed, and 2, honestly, this is something that's fairly easy to read for yourself. Instead, what I would like to talk about is the elements of those styles, or what you could call the ingredients that come to the different styles of adventures that you might offer your players. So to that effect, we're going to look at 5 common ingredients that are worth considering for the different adventures that you might design. The cook time, or number of sessions that you'll be playing, the exploration scenes, the combat encounters, the role-playing encounters, and the tropes associated with a given style. So our first ingredient in adventure design is the number of sessions that our adventure, our story arc, is going to last. Essentially, it's the cook time for that part of the meal. An experienced chef understands that different recipes require a different cook time, and that if you cook a particular recipe too long, you actually spoil the meal, and that's one of the things you should keep in mind when you are designing an adventure. Certain types of adventures lend themselves to numerous sessions. You can play for a very long time and keep a certain style of adventure going, and it will feel very natural. Other adventures, or story arcs, cook very quickly, and if you try to drag them out too long, you end up spoiling the experience. An example of this is the horror adventure. Adventures that rely on fear and the unknown and the suspense of what might be around any given corner, that can be a delicious recipe, but it's hard to maintain those ingredients for a long time. A horror-based story arc is the kind of meal that you want to assume is going to be relatively short compared to other adventure styles. Most of them will last 1 session, some of them might last 2, but if you go too long, you're probably going to lose the tension and spoil the story. On the flip side of things, the planar adventure, where you're traveling not just across the world, but across planes to amazing locations in vastly different areas, those sorts of adventures are hard to rush. You have to allow for a lot of time for the experience to even kind of land effectively. The Game Mastery Guide notes that the typical planar adventure is probably going to last 6 to 8 sessions. You're looking at 2, 3, maybe even 4 months worth of play that go into what is essentially a single story arc for your campaign. Every style of adventure is different, but it is important to understand that different types of stories naturally lend to different lengths of how those stories should be told. Some stories are short and quick, but pack a lot of punch. Other stories need to cook a little bit longer, but the experience is still exquisite. Our second ingredient when it comes to crafting an adventure is exploration scenes. And this is probably one of the ingredients that's easy to overlook, but as a storyteller, you don't want to skip this. It's kind of like the broth in a soup. Sure, it's not the most exciting ingredient, but if you left it out, the recipe would end up really dry. Exploration helps break apart some of the other ingredients in your story so that when those ingredients are encountered, they pack a little more punch. No matter what style of story you are telling, you want to include at least some exploration scenes for your party to enjoy. Now, the types of exploration are obviously going to vary from style to style. A military campaign would likely see many of its exploration scenes in the form of military marches, establishing forts or shoring up defensive points, patrolling borders, those kinds of things. That's the sort of military activity that interacts with the environment, and it is an important element in help maintaining that style of adventure. Alternatively, if you're running a romantic style of story, and mostly I'm including this example in here because I think it's hilarious that Paizo took the time to give us notes on romantic style stories. I just did not expect to see that in the Game Mastery Guide. If you were running a romantic style story, the exploration of a romance story is going to be very different. It would often feature characters exploring a location together that they find exciting or unique or exhilarating, and the feel of the exploration scene is going to be very different, but it is still an important part of the story. For another example, mystery stories might include things like secret layers or puzzles during their exploration scenes. We've spent a lot of time in this series talking about how it's important to use the environment to help draw your players into the story, and regardless of what style of adventure you're crafting, you do want to make sure that these exploration scenes are there to really support the overall feel of whatever recipe you are cooking. Of course, when it comes to developing an adventure, if you want to get to the real meaty part of the adventure, it's time to talk about the combat encounters that you include in a given story arc. Man, I am really stretching the recipe metaphors in this video. But I do think it's important to note that TTRPGs, Pathfinder, Dungeons & Dragons, whatever you might be playing, combat is an important part of the story. In other videos in the series, we have talked about the fact that combat is one of the best ways to include tension in a narrative, and tension is often a shortcut to player engagement, so combat is an important part of any story arc that you might craft. Certain stories are obviously going to feature combat more significantly than others. I would hope that a military campaign has more combat than a romantic subplot, but you do want to think, how am I going to use combats throughout this particular story arc to emphasize important ideas and help bring tension and excitement to my players? Now, Paizo, for each of the different styles that we listed earlier, they have a recommended spread of types of encounters that you can use, and they use the low, moderate, severe, those designations for how to build combat encounters in Pathfinder 2e. We've discussed those in previous videos. They use those different designations to help say you should have 3 low threat encounters, 4 moderate threat encounters, 6 severe threat encounters. They give you suggestions on the different levels of threat that are worth including. But even then, as a storyteller, it is important to think about where to include those threats, how to include those threats, and what purpose they're going to serve in the recipe that you're cooking. In a horror adventure, you're likely going to use severe and maybe even the occasional extreme threat encounter as a way to heighten the tension and fear that your players are experiencing. Meanwhile, in a mystery story, Combat encounters might be relatively rare and might serve more as a climax as your characters are attempting to bring a suspect to justice. Every style of story will use combat differently, but every style of story will have some combats that you're going to want to think about when, where, and how to add to the recipe that you're making. I guess it's time to add some veggies to our meal and talk about role-playing encounters. How on earth am I going to turn role-playing encounters into veggies in this allegory? Paizo, this allegory is getting thin. Many players seem to default to an attitude that role-playing encounters are not an essential part of the game, sort of like a kid that's trying to push the veggies off their plate. But as you mature, you realize that the veggies and the role-playing encounters are bringing some important nutrients to the meal and improving the experience overall. As a storyteller, you want to give some substance to your recipe and include role-playing encounters that your players are going to enjoy. Now again, the style of the story arc is going to affect what kind of role-playing encounters you can use. An intrigue story is likely to have a lot more role-playing than a dungeon crawl, but it doesn't mean that dungeon crawls don't have an opportunity to use role-playing encounters. For example, maybe your PCs can meet a guardian that can be negotiated with and might actually help the party bypass traps if the party is willing to take the time to negotiate with them and help them. Now, one of the great things about role-playing encounters as ingredients is this really is one of the areas where you're going to start seeing a lot of variety when you let your creativity flow. For an intrigue-style game, you can get political and courtroom dramas. A mystery might involve trying to get answers from a reluctant witness. High and planar adventures could involve conversations with rare and magical creatures that PCs normally wouldn't get to interact with. A lot of people see role-playing encounters as dull, but as a storyteller, if you take some time to really think about what role-playing encounters can fit inside of the adventure you're designing, you can get some very creative and satisfying options to present to your players. And on this particular point, if you're struggling a bit, I do highly recommend check out the different styles presented in the Game Mastery Guide, because Paizo does a good job of offering different suggested role-playing encounters that are a natural fit inside the different styles that they offer. And now we can finish up our recipe and spice up our adventures a bit with the final ingredient, the style tropes of our stories. Trope is a term that's used to describe common, anticipated, or well-known elements that go with certain types of stories. If I'm telling a sci-fi story, there are certain things that you would just naturally expect as part of that story. Same thing for gritty adventures, same thing for dungeon crawls, intrigue, military, whatever it may be, there are certain things that you are naturally going to expect, and your players are too. So when you are planning out an adventure, when you are creating that recipe, you want to think about the different tropes that you need to spice up that particular story. And like all spices, you want to be careful with how much you use. A little bit of spice can add a ton of flavor to a meal and make it just really hit the right spot. But too much spice can be overwhelming and cause people to want to push the plate away. Tropes are the same way. Your players know them, and to be honest, love them. But if you go too heavy with the tropes, it's easy for it to spoil the meal. A good example of this from pop culture, I hated the movie Alien Resurrection, and basically the reason I hated it was it overused the false jump scare way too many times and just took me completely out of the movie. There were probably a lot of other reasons to hate that movie, but the fake jump scare was one of the worst parts for me. Every style of adventure has its tropes. Horror stories have the jump scare. Military stories are going to have things like cavalry charges. Romantic stories frequently feature duels against a rival. Every style of story has different tropes that are anticipated with it, and as a storyteller, it is a good idea to note what those tropes are and put a dash of them from time to time into the story that you are writing. Don't overdo it, but make sure you're getting that flavor in there. And again here, for the different styles that Paizo lists, they do a good job of offering different tropes, different spices that you can add to your story. And I think it's good casual reading that's worth considering when you are doing adventure design. Now, there is one final element of adventure design that Paizo doesn't really talk about in the Game Mastery Guide, and I really have no idea how to make this a recipe allegory at this point, so sorry I'm dropping that ball. But there is still one thing that I think is worth talking about, and that is the idea that adventures, story arcs, typically last a number of different sessions. 2, 3, 4, on up to 6, 7, 8, 9 sessions. Story arcs go on for a while, and so the assumption of writing a story arc is you're not going to complete the entire story in a single session. So one of the special considerations as a storyteller is you want to think, at least in general, about good places where you can pause a story so that it will be easy for you and your players to pick up at the next session. As an example from my home game, my players are trying to sneak past undead forces and deliver a military message to another city. And they have been given a map of some hideouts that they can try to use as they're crossing the terrain as places to avoid the undead that are coming for them. I kind of use those different hideouts that my players might stop at as possible places where I can pause a story. It's a very clear geographic location, it's a very clear spot, it makes for a very clean break at the end of the story, and a natural starting point as the players step out when the next session begins. The point here is simple. As a game master, take some time to think about how can I break this story up so that it will flow very naturally from one session to another. Now, this is not an exact science, and anyone who has ever had to deal with players knows they are probably going to throw you off and mess up your schedule more than once, but it is still something that you want to think about and at least have in mind when you're writing out your adventures. But that ends our discussion of the different styles of adventures, the recipes, if you will, and the different ingredients that go into those recipes. The other element that Paizo discusses for adventure design is threats, and in the next video in this series, we're going to talk about different types of threats that players might be dealing with. But that's all that I've got for you today, so let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on adventure design and the different styles or recipes that Paizo gives us? Is there a particular style or recipe that you are really fond of using as a storyteller? And if so, what do you think are the critical ingredients? Also, are there certain ingredients that you enjoy using more than others? And if so, how does that affect the different styles of adventures, the different recipes that you tend to offer your players? Jump down into the comments section and give me your thoughts. And if you have any advice on this topic, feel free to leave that as well. Don't forget to do all of the YouTube stuff. If you enjoyed the video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Both of those are linked in the video description. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.